Handheld gaming, past, present and future. Handheld gaming has always been special. Computer games that fit in your pocket and go wherever you go. What more is there to say, really? Well, I'm going to say a few more things about it. But first, a few words about me, if I manage to get that thing working. Is there anything I need to do to make the... Oh, yes, now it works. A few words about me. I'm Markus. I've been doing this whole game dev thing for a while, most recently as a small little part of Niantic. So, follow me on an odyssey to find out what made the handheld games of old so memorable and to try and see what the future might hold for us. I'll show you a whole lot of devices and games, and I invite you to fall into a few rabbit holes with me along the way. So, buckle up for a look back in time. It all begins with the first microcontrollers. The Texas Instruments TMS 1100 was one of the very first ones. A whole computer on a chip. Whoa! And it enabled the creation of the Merlin, notable as one of the earliest handheld computer games. It included 6 games, like tic-tac-toe, as you can see in the video here. Essentially, you press the new game button, press the first button on top to pick the first game, and then you play tic-tac-toe. Whenever you want it to be the computer's turn, you have to press the comp turn button. It doesn't just automatically do it. And it doesn't even have a color LED. It was basically just a bunch of LEDs, a few buttons, and a sound module. But it's also notable because it was maybe one of the very first digital sequencers, because game number 2 was Music Machine, where you entered a sequence of notes. 0 is the pause button, basically, and then you press comp turn to play it back. And even the manual included the sequences for a bunch of popular songs. I'm sure it was magical back then, but oh boy, have we come a long way. 1 year later, in 1979, Milton Bradley released the Microvision, a portable console that you buy, and then later you can buy additional games for it. But they are struggling to birth the concept of game cartridges into the world, because you buy new games as new faceplates for the thing. And the faceplate included the CPU and the memory for the game. So on one hand, that allowed them to keep the cost of the device low, but every single game was pretty expensive. It was like every game was like $20 back then, US dollars, which is in today's money like $90 US, which is steep. It also meant that you kind of the layout of the buttons and the exposed buttons were different for every game, which was nice, but the buttons didn't really feel that great. Also, the display was 16 by 16 pixels, and every single game for it was terrible. You can see here the Blockbuster game that came included with the device. This is actually the slowest speed that you can set it to. So essentially, you had no chance with this game ever. And all the other games were very similar to this. Like half the games were basically a ball bouncing around, except with baseball. You kind of had to hit the ball and it bounced in different ways, and in some games you had to avoid the ball. It wasn't all that great. The question is, could you have made a good game with 16 by 16 pixels? I'm sure you could have. But Milton Bradley, maybe they were just never really that good with game design, because they're also responsible for terrible board games like the Game of Games or the Game of Life. Who knows? But even despite being somewhat terrible in retrospect, the Microvision was still an important stepping stone, because there's some interviews out there with early Nintendo people who said that this was the inspiration for the Game & Watch and later for the Game Boy. And so, a year later, the first Game & Watch was released by Nintendo. Interesting thing, it's not a pixel display. You have individual LCD segments that get turned on and off. So you didn't have a lot of variety of putting multiple games on the thing. But it looked fairly alright due to that for the time. And in my circle of elementary school kids, we had like 2 or 3 of those, and the Octopus one I remember especially well. That was good fun. And of course, after that, there were like ton of these games and also a ton of knockoffs. Here in New Zealand, the brick game was really popular. I've only learned about this like yesterday, but looks nice. They also released some Game & Watch in watch form, and where I grew up in Austria, they actually sold it under the name Trikotronic, so I was never even aware of the watch aspect. Never noticed the time being displayed anywhere. Yes, it was all we had at the time. But then a few years later, Nintendo released the Game Boy, and now we have actual game cartridges with new games that you can buy, and a ton of them too. And that was really cool at the time. In my circle of elementary school friends, like picture a bunch of boys all huddled around that tiny screen, taking turns playing Nintendo World Cup. That was a good time. And the Game Boy probably had the best game lineup for a launch of any console ever, with Tetris and Super Mario. Unbeaten to this day, I would say. And Tetris is still fun to play to this day. I still play that regularly. Yes, other standout games, of course, Zelda and Pokemon and all sorts of things. The same year that the Game Boy was released, Atari, who was the big player in console games at that time, released the Lynx. But despite its faster processor and having a backlit color LCD display, it never became as popular as the Game Boy. One reason for that might be that even though the Lynx might look small, it was actually massive, almost as big as the Steam Deck. And the games, I don't know, California Games was alright, but everyone had already played that on the C64 at the time. And Stun Runner is usually quoted as the standout game for the Lynx. And I've never played it on an actual Lynx, but playing it in an emulator today, I have to say Stun Runner does not hold up that well. I can see how it maybe was like a precursor to games like Wipeout and stuff, but yeah, no one would play this today. The third big player at the time was Sega, and they released the Game Gear in 1990. And initially, everyone was impressed. It had a color display and apparently superior performance. But the problem was that Sonic the Hedgehog was just never as good as Mario. And another big problem was that that thing ate 6 AA batteries in 4 hours, which essentially was unsustainable on an elementary school kid's income. In the early 90s, I got 5 shillings of pocket money per week, which is like 65 cents in New Zealand dollars. And I tried to research what a battery cost in the early 90s by looking at scans of old mail order catalogs, and it turns out it cost about $1. So 2 months of pocket money would have gotten me 4 hours of playtime on the Game Gear. The one friend that I had who owned one luckily had the power adapter to plug in. But what that meant was that when he brought it to school and we played it in lunch break, we were huddled in the back corner of the classroom. Whereas with the Game Boy, 2 AA batteries got us like 20 hours of playtime outside under a tree. Yeah, that's how we all slowly were drawn inside. Then roughly 10 years passed until the next handheld grabbed my attention, the PSP. And my white PSP 1000, the original version, is my favorite console or favorite handheld console to this day. It's now lovingly known as the Fat PSP. I guess Sony provoked that nickname by releasing the Slim PSP afterwards. And it was pretty comfortable to hold. It had an amazing set of features and a lot of good games, from simple puzzle games like Mercury Meltdown. Let me try that laser point button. Luminous was the other puzzle game, up to all the way to like PS2 quality flagship titles like GTA and God of War, and nice little exclusives like Me and My Katamari was great, and Loco Roco is, I think, the standout title for this console. That was a good time. Also, you could actually put MP3s and videos on that thing and watch them on the go, which means, remind you, that was before smartphones were a thing, so having that thing in my pocket on the bus in 2005 or whatever felt pretty futuristic. Yeah, and like Sid Meier's Pirates, even though it was in no way made for the PSP, it worked just so well on it. At the same time, roughly, Nintendo released the DS, which had 2 screens and a stylus. I don't know if there were ever any games made that were really taking proper advantage of the stylus, but I appreciate that they put it there and gave us more creative possibilities, or new unexplored space, basically. It had more Mario, more Zelda, more Pokemon, Brain Age, and Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney ports. For a while, flatmates all over the world would hear shouts of "objection" through their walls. That was a really good time. I think the DS was the perfect platform for Phoenix Wright. In any case, I mostly stuck to the PSP for the 2000s, but I appreciate the DS. And I think the DS is actually the second most best-selling console in the world after the family of DS, after the PS2, I think. Yeah, and then smartphones happened. With the release of the iPhone 3G and the App Store, a whole deluge of mobile games came over the world. And there were some really good ones, and novel, interesting ideas like Spider, The Secret of Bryce Manor was nice. Whoops, let me try that. Then like Flight Control, Monument Valley, anyone remember Infinity Blade? And I too spent a few years of my life making mobile games and had a good time with it. But there's one thing that smartphones were really missing: ergonomics and physical controls. Well, two things. Touch screens are great, but you constantly block the view with your fingers and you don't get proper haptic feedback. Like the pleasure of pressing a button is not to be underestimated in gaming. And later on, the advancements in technology and camera technique also, of course, enabled stuff like Pokemon Go and other augmented reality games. Yeah, after the PSP, Sony released the PS Vita in 2011. Essentially, it looks like the design team took the PSP and stuffed everything on top that they could possibly think of. It has a OLED touchscreen, a second thumbstick, a built-in camera, a SIM card slot, the ability to remote play PS4 games, and a touch-sensitive backside. Very few games ever use that to effect, but I think Tearaway probably has to be the standout game for this console because it really tried to use every single feature of that console. And it's quite nice. Like you can see on the video on top, you can basically poke your fingers into the game world and manipulate it like that. That was a really nice touch. The one thing that held the Vita back in my eyes was the horribly ugly UI. I don't know, they had a perfectly good PS3 style interface on the PSP. Who came up with the idea of having lots of wiggly bubbles? I don't know. But in general, they had some like launch titles like Uncharted and all sorts of bigger games, but we're kind of moving more towards them trying to port over existing franchises in their full form rather than having smaller, more quickly playable games. The thing I played most on the PS Vita was probably Minecraft. And then nothing happened for a long while until Nintendo released the Switch in 2017, because everyone else was busy playing games on their cell phones. The Switch's got more Mario, more Pokemon, more Zelda, although the best Zelda, I would argue, at this point. And lots and lots of ports. It also has some nice quirky games, like the entire labor thing was a nice combination of arts and crafts that you shove your controllers into for interesting effects. And yeah, don't get me wrong, the Switch is great, but at this point we also have to realize that we've kind of taken a step away from traditional handheld gaming, because this is simply a full console made portable. And from here we basically move on to portable PCs like the Steam Deck or the Asus ROG Ally and many other upcoming knockoffs that are literally PCs made portable. They're essentially laptops in a different form factor. And that means that the games that you can play on them are also simply PC games. And in a way you could say that thanks to advancements in technology, every game can now be a handheld game. Worlds have merged, end of story. Or wait, yes, it's great that we can play PC games on the go now, but I can't shake the feeling that we've lost something along the way. So let's have a look at what we've gained and what we've lost over the years. Well, we've definitely gained colors. We went from 4 shades of green on the Game Boy to 16 million colors on an OLED screen. We gained screen real estate, lots and lots of processing power, more buttons, thumbsticks, touch screens. But what did we lose along the way? Is it charm, simplicity, creativity? It's hard to put a finger on, but maybe it helps if we define a few terms. Ludwig Wittgenstein talks about the word game in his philosophical investigations, and he said, "We don't know the boundaries because none have been drawn. Well, in the 100 years since, some boundaries have been drawn, so we can now define play as any spontaneous, voluntary activity done for enjoyment or recreation, rather than for a serious or practical purpose. We can say a toy is an object used or designed for play, and a game is a structured form of play with rules and often a specific objective or goal. And Bernard Suits also contributed a definition for the word game: voluntary effort to overcome unnecessary obstacles. Good job making us all look like idiots, right? Unnecessary obstacles. Anyway, we've only really looked at computer games so far, but let's assume that the hardware is not the entire story, and let's look even further back in time and go beyond computer games. In 1978, Tomy released the Digital Derby Auto Raceway, a fully mechanical handheld game, no microcontroller, no CPU of any kind anywhere in there. They tried to capture the arcade experience that was big in the 70s, but without putting in a computer. And they called it digital, even though it was most definitely analog. The interesting thing is that this device anticipates what handheld consoles would be like later without actually being one. And if you look at it, they were even trying to replicate the look of a display on that game. And actually, it was just rolls of film in there that moved at different speeds depending on what kind of setting or what gear your car was in. And they released a whole lot of these kinds of games, and there were also countless other companies that did that. Tomy had their entire, what was it called, Digital Arcade or something? No, what was it called? Something like that. Pocket Arcade. In those years. But the Digital Derby is especially interesting if you look at a device that they made just 2 years earlier, the Drive Yourself Crazy. Here, they were not yet trying to replicate the look of a display. Here, basically, you just have a plastic car and a rolling background, driven by a battery, and you move the little car around. But let's go beyond even all electronic devices and see what games there are that are highly portable and mostly handheld, like physical puzzles and dexterity games and simple portable two-player games like we all have played in kindergarten and with our siblings and friends, like Mastermind or Connect 4. Or what about game books? You read a story, but you choose your own path through it. The very first one was apparently Consider the Consequences, a romantic novel from the year 1930. You can read it on the Internet Archive if that ever comes back online. Or if you Google it, they actually have someone made a web version where you just click on the different choices so you don't have to flip through all the pages. The first choice you make, you can choose if you either follow the lady or one of her two love interests. And yeah, it pioneered that genre. Later, in the late 70s, the Choose Your Own Adventure books basically took over that genre and defined it forever. Newer addition to that broad genre is our journaling games. And one that I can really recommend is A 1000-Year-Old Vampire. The way it works is you essentially roll, or basically you come up with a character from a long time ago, and then at every step you roll 2 dice and go back and forwards in the long list of prompts in the book. You read the prompt and then you write an entry and define something new that happens. Sometimes it says, make a memory, because your character only has 5 slots for memories, and each slot can hold a number of smaller sub-memories that relate to the same memory. And along the way, you meet people, you lose people, you gain possessions, you lose possessions, and you're trying to hold on to the remnants of your humanity. But oh, that book makes you do terrible things and go through horrible experiences. And at some point, you've built yourself a fairly comfortable life as a vampire, with friends and stuff, and then it's like something terrible happens, it's 100 years later, everyone you know is dead, go from there. The book has lots of warnings in the beginning that if you're not in a stable mental state, don't play it, and that would probably be correct. But definitely a good experience. And if you get the actual physical book, it looks like an old library book. It's really, really well done. Or how about card games? The national card game of Austria, where I'm from, is Schnapsen. And especially the 4-player variant, Vierer Schnapsen, is actually quite good. It's a trick-taking game that all you need is a deck of 20 cards. The preferred design in Austria is double German with Wilhelm Tell and all these other guys. And essentially it's a trick-taking game where you choose one of multiple possible maneuvers, and the highest counting maneuver is the one that actually gets played. And it has some small bits of social deception in there. You need a good bit of tactics, some math skills. And yeah, my grandma recently died at 99, and she was a huge fan of that game. Everyone who visited was eventually roped into a game of Schnapsen. And I suspect that she only decided at like age 95 to move into a retirement home because she was slowly running out of neighbors and friends to play against. Yeah, the game itself has been around for about 200 years, and earlier variants even go back to as like being mentioned in the early 1700s. It's a perfect mix of social fun and tactics and stuff like that. And if you think about it, a hand of cards is not that different from a smartphone. Why have we never figured out any games that work this well in a social context with like a shared central space between players? Because you can easily recreate the rules of that game or any card game in computer game form. But this game without the social aspect is not even half as fun. So that's something we can explore in the future with our game development adventures. Here's one game that is truly handheld as a card game, in the most literal sense possible. Galdor's Grip is a like print and play game from a few years ago, and the way it works is this: you have on every card in the top left you have a number, and the number says how many cards from the top of your deck you're allowed to take, reorder in any way you want, and put at the bottom of your deck. So essentially, you're going through your deck again and again and reordering it as you go. And you want to reorder it in a way so you get to the cards that give you stars, because you need a certain amount of stars to win, and you're trying to avoid the cards that do bad stuff and make you lose the game. It's quite clever, actually. Another genre that we can explore are pencil and paper games. Do you know dots and boxes? I played that with my other grandma a lot when I was in elementary school. Essentially, you have a grid of dots, and on your turn, everyone has a different colored pencil. You get to draw a line between two dots, and if you manage to box in, or like if you manage to make a box, you get to color it in your color or write in your initials or something like that. And then you get to go again. So essentially, you're trying to avoid situations where the other player can finish a box, but you're trying to create situations that get you to finish as many of them in a row as possible. Quite a good time. Then, of course, tic-tac-toe, hangman, or city, country, river. My kids informed me that this is called as categories when they play it in school. Or what about dice? They're easy to carry in your pocket, and there are countless simple luck-based games that you can play with them. The earliest form of dice were knuckle bones, the ankle bones of animals, because their shape and form lend themselves well to being thrown and coming to a somewhat random outcome. But the game that we actually now know as knuckle bones does not rely on luck. It's actually like dexterity, skill-based game, and it developed basically in all continents more or less separately. And the way it works is this: you have like a bigger object that you throw into the air, and then you need to either pick up or manipulate smaller objects in a certain way before you catch that object again. And that's still played in lots of places all over the world, apparently. Or string games like Cat's Cradle. But let's now move past all our physical possessions and go even simpler. What about games that you play with just hands? Everyone knows rock, paper, scissors. It's handheld insofar as you hold out your hand to play it. And it's a quick way to settle who's doing the dishes, or can be a drawn-out battle of the minds. Mora was already played in ancient Rome. They called the game micatio, which means flashing. And playing it was called micare digitis, so basically a flashing of the fingers. And the way you play it is this. 2 or more players each shoot out a hand and show 0 to 5 fingers, and at the same time yell out their guess for how many the sum of fingers would be. And if you guess correctly, you get a point, and first to 3 points wins. This game is still big in Italy to this day. They have outdoor tournaments for this still. A simpler version of this is odds and evens for just 2 players. One player is odd, one player is even. You shoot out 0 to 5 fingers. If the result is odd wins, otherwise even wins. And you can see Jerry and George settling a dispute with odds and evens there. Chopsticks is a game I learned from my kids. They learned that in school from the other kids. You basically try to eliminate someone else's fingers with mild doses of math. You start with 2 fingers, the chopsticks, and you can give someone else your fingers. If it's your turn, you can touch someone else's fingers, and then they get the amount of fingers that you have on your hand. So if I have 2 here, I can give the 2 here, now there's 3. And the goal is to get them to 5 fingers, because that eliminates their hand. But if they still have 1 hand with some fingers, they can bring the hand back by splitting it up instead of doing an actual turn. But if you manage to get rid of both of their hands, then you win. And then there's games where it's literally about actually eliminating someone else's fingers, like thumb wrestling or red hands. In red hands, you're trying to slap someone else's hand before they can pull it away, and they're not allowed to pull it away before you start moving. Or the kids the tougher kids in school play this with knuckles because it hurts more. And then there's a game called Bloody Knuckles that's not about quick reaction time anymore. That's literally about how much pain you can endure because someone else hits you with the knuckles, and the longer you can hold out, the tougher you are, I guess. I don't know if it's a game. In the same way as you can say, is a fist fight a game? Is it a social multiplayer game, or is it something else? Yeah. Along those lines, I was thinking, are there any single-player games that are just played with our hands? I guess twiddling your thumbs doesn't really count, and I couldn't really come up with anything. The one thing I came up with needs one little accessory, and it's a 5-finger fillet. Fun for the whole family to watch. After this, you probably don't want to use your hands in games anymore. So what about games where you don't even need hands? I Spy with My Little Eyes, played on road trips all over the world. Or yellow car. You want to be the first one to yell out, yellow car, whenever a yellow car is visible. Or unfortunately is a game where you basically say a sentence that ends with unfortunately and someone else has to finish it. Like, Grandma baked a bunch of cookies. Unfortunately, and then someone else has to finish that sentence in a horribly creative way usually. License plate acronyms. You look at a license plate, try to come up with a sentence for it. At this point, you might be asking yourself, how deep can we go? What about games you play entirely in your head? You could say that Praying is essentially a single-player storytelling game where you're trying to negotiate with an imaginary higher being by loosely interpreting the rules from an ancient book to your advantage. Or Counting. As you traverse the world, you can obsessively count infinitely many things. Or next step up from there is magical thinking. Something terrible will happen if I step on one of the black tiles instead, just the white ones. Or will the sun rise tomorrow if I don't touch every single post I walk past? Maybe it will, but why risk it? But turns out, this is generally not considered a game, but OCD. And most sources online are concerned with not making this as fun as possible, like us game developers would, but instead are more concerned with how can you stop doing this. But all of this reminded me of one of my favorite books, Die Schachnovelle by Stefan Zweig. The English title is The Royal Game. And the main character in there gets imprisoned by the Gestapo. Stefan Zweig wrote this in exile in 1942. And the character in there has some valuable information that the Gestapo wants from him. And he is not willing to give that up, so they lock him in a room with nothing to do and no view. And after a few weeks, he sees that his mental state is beginning to deteriorate. But with some sheer luck, he manages to steal a book out of the coat pocket of one of the guards. And his starved mind is jubilating, anticipating some work of literature that he can sink his teeth into, but to his utter disappointment, it's a collection of games of chess. And so it's all he has, so he starts replaying those games first on his checkered spreadsheet, then in his mind, and then he starts playing against himself in his mind. I don't want to give away too much, but it got me thinking, what do people in solitary confinement do? They have nothing but time. Do they come up with any interesting games? Turns out it's not a topic that has been looked at much by ludology from what I could find. I found some prisoners that talk about counting or planning, like escape, revenge, or they make lists of like all the bird species they can remember. Or I found one guy who mentioned he broke apart his Dio stick to get to the little plastic ball inside so he could practice 2 pounds, which is apparently a popular game in American prisons. The way it works is you have like a bucket or something that you want to hit into, and then you need to hit it with a certain number of bounces, and they apparently bet on it and stuff. Yeah. But generally, it's not a good environment for game design, as it turns out, because most people don't design games in there. They rather develop psychological damage. Okay, let's slowly reverse back out of that dark corner. And yeah, we've looked at a lot of games from different eras. To help us put everything into context, I made up some excellent terms, if I may say so myself. The real-world disconnectedness level is the first axis that I want to look at, which means either a game is heads up, you either augment the world, make the boring bits interesting, or work with the stuff that's available in the physical world, or it's heads down, where you dive into a different world and ignore the real one. And the second axis is the social disconnectedness level, meaning you either play with or against others, or you play alone. I've mapped out some of the stuff that we looked at, and you can see the older hand-based games, they are more in the social, somewhat heads-up corner. All the handheld game consoles of old are pretty solidly in the alone and heads-down corner. The alone heads-up corner is somewhat unexplored, and Yellow Car is probably one of the most heads-up and social games you can find at this point. So what interesting observations can we make from this? Games have become more complex over the years. Is this thanks to advances in technology? Sure, but I would argue that that's not the entire story, because the circumstances of how we play games also have changed. Back when everyone had 7 siblings and kids spent their entire free time outside playing with all the other kids of the village, games were short and social. But now, statistically, only every second kid in New Zealand even has a sibling, and they spend less time outside and have longer periods of solitude. And that, of course, lends itself to single-player games and games that are more complex, that you can invest more time into. Here. Now, if we essentially went from kids in groups playing Knucklebones to a kid on a Steam Deck playing Minecraft alone in their room. So also, if you can now play all games on a handheld device, then handheld as a category doesn't really mean anything anymore. But we can say that we still want a category of games that are easy to bring with us wherever we go, and they are quick to play, easy to pick up and put down. They're intimate because you hold them close to your body rather than playing something on the screen on the other side of the room. And optionally, we want them to be social or easy, at least easy to share with others, like take turns playing, and innovative, like because the console provides unique controls or other unique creative possibilities for you to use. But what do we call this if we can't call it handheld anymore? Is it pocketable, stopgap games, snack gaming? I like bite-sized gaming, but feel free to come up with a better term. So, where do we go from here? What could the games in our newly defined category be like? Well, they could simply be the same old games. One avenue is retro all the way. I've already got all the games I'll ever need. You can get like one of those emulator devices that are coming out of China by the boatload. Like I've got a Mio Mini Plus. It has a nice screen, really nice controls, and it plays everything from Game Boy to PS1 perfectly fine. You have 40 years of gaming history in your pocket if you want to. Or you go the other route and get like a device that does FPGA, like field programmable gate array. They are not just emulating the game, you're actually emulating the underlying hardware, and you can play the original cartridges on those devices. Or another attempt would be to say we try to recreate the past. We make something that resembles one of the game consoles of old, but does something clever and new with it, like the Playdate, for example. It has a crank. How's that for new creative possibilities? It also has a free SDK in the simulator. You can even like make games and release them without a walled garden, which is always nice. Or you could make new games but run them on one of those cheap emulator devices. For example, the Mio Mini Plus runs Pico 8 just fine. So you can make a Pico 8 game and play it on that. Or you use a game engine. Let's loosely use that term here. But like Lutro or Chilove, and they are built on top of RetroArch, the emulator software that's used in those devices to run something on there. Or you go hardcore and make a game in Game Boy Studio, an actual Game Boy game that you then either get someone to make a cartridge or play in an emulator. Yeah, we can also make super individual and stuff by building our own hardware. We have an amazing set of possibilities here and can explore entirely new directions. I fell down that rabbit hole over the last year a little bit by trying to connect some microcontrollers to different displays and making little games with them. And then I came across the ArduBoy and built myself one of those. You essentially buy all the components for like 20 bucks on AliExpress, and then you stuff them in a box and shake it, and this is what comes out. And you can use the ArduBoy 2 library to make games for it. And I've, over the last 2 terms, I helped teach some kids in high school make a game for the ArduBoy that they built in school. So if you want to get into that kind of thing, on my blog website thing, I have some articles that teach you all the basics of C++ and how to make a little jump and run game, like the little guy Bert down here that I made. Yeah, and it has endless possibilities. The big downside on this approach is that your target audience is probably going to be fairly small. If you make a custom little console, then the target audience might just be you, which, yeah, if that matters to you. We can also go the lazy route in the future and say we just use our mobile phones for everything. Everyone has one, so huge target audience. It can do a lot, including augmented reality. But it doesn't have physical buttons like I mentioned, and it's full of walled gardens, which is also sad. Or we can say the Steam Deck can do it all. It can play bite-sized games and everything else, because just because it can play AAA games doesn't mean it can't also play small bite-sized games as well. And it's big and heavy. Well, you're big and heavy. Or maybe the games of the future will be in VR. I haven't mentioned VR a lot, but VR has become portable over the last little while. The only question is, where would you go with it? You probably don't want to play a VR game on a bus stop because you'll miss the bus and you'll get mugged. But yeah. So I've tried to use VR outside. It's not a great experience. Doesn't really work. You really want to do this at home with no one else watching. The biggest wildcard, though, in this entire spectrum of possibilities is spatial computing. I suggest you go to my colleague Tom's talk tomorrow. I can point him out with the laser pointer. He'll talk about making multiplayer XR games tomorrow at 11:35. And the team that I'm on at Niantic, we've also been trying to experiment with co-localized social multiplayer experiences like contraptions up here. There's got a trailer on YouTube, and if you go back in time to the last GDC, was it a GDC, then you can try it out. Or at Magic Leap, we were also trying to make co-localized multiplayer experiences. Well, you still have the problem that the form factor is a bit weird of the devices, and the battery life is still quite short, and it doesn't work all that well outdoors. But the possibilities are endless because it's a huge unexplored space. And the really cool thing about it is, I mapped this out again here, that we're on the verge of unlocking the entire heads-up social corner with mixed reality and spatial computing that we basically so far haven't really managed to explore with computer games. Yeah, you can also see I put the original quest down here, almost off screen in the alone heads down corner. And they're trying to get closer to the heads up social space, but pass through video, it's slowly getting there, I guess. You can see these are classic, the classic console, handheld game consoles of old in the lone heads down corner. You can play the Switch. If you play like Mario Kart on the Switch in local multiplayer, I mean, it's handheld insofar as you can carry it wherever you want and then put it down on the table. That's, yeah. All right, my last point is my idealistic vision of how I'd like the world to be. Well, I would like to have, for the games of the future, open hardware. I'd like to have an open OS and a modular hardware architecture. Think framework laptop, but as a handheld game console. So easy to repair, everyone can create modules and extensions for it. Everything is a world of open possibilities. There would be no walled gardens, wouldn't that be nice? So no 30% tax on whatever you make just because you want to release it on a specific device. And people would be motivated by vision rather than money. We could finance this with a universal basic income, drifting off into a social direction now. Yeah, but take a look around yourself and ask yourself, like all the tools and platforms you use, what would they look like if the companies behind them were not motivated by money, but were actually trying to make your lives better and your work easier? What if Adobe would put their effort into making good software for creative people rather than buying up all the competition and trying to milk us with subscription fees? What about what would Facebook look like if their goal was not to get us addicted to doom scrolling so they can show us as many ads as possible, but instead try to enable us to make meaningful social connections? What would Apple's hardware look like? They have the best engineers in the world. No one can tell me it's not possible to make the battery and RAM and hard drive upgradable. Yeah, anyway. All I want is to make great games. Any questions?
Hi. I wonder where solo tabletop RPGs would fit in your one of those cross graphs you had.
Yeah, I thought they were a bit of a borderline case because they are portable as such, but then you need to play them on a table. But yeah, I would say definitely somewhat heads down, but very social usually. Mm-hmm.
But there are ones you can play with just one player, where you have the book and you go through and like do all the numbers yourself and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same point as like with the Steam Deck, right? You can carry it wherever you want, but it's so big and heavy that usually you just play it at home on the couch anyway. So it's a similar category, right? Because there's a lot of interesting games. Like one of my favorite board games is Final Girl. And it's a single player game where you basically, it's like one of those film tropes, you know, like the horror movies where you only have that one girl left in the end and she has to confront the killer. It's basically that in board game form, and it's a great time for one player. So definitely a valid, yeah. The entire story with like having, going from like the term handheld to something like bite-sized is kind of washing out the entire term a little bit, right? So I guess bite-sized means it can be something that's fairly stationary as well.
Thanks.
Right. Just out of curiosity, you covered so many things there. What would be the one game, what would be your desert island handheld game, the one, if you've only got one, you can have, and that's it?
Oh, that's very difficult. Well, I might just go with Tetris. It's endlessly replayable and still fun after, how long has it been out? 40 years or something? So, yeah, but it does get a bit repetitive. No.
Hello. Do you have any
opinions, I suppose, on games like Tearaway, where it's like using those sub-features, because like Astrobot came out for the PS5, and it uses all of the crazy features of the controller, but nothing else does, because everything's trying to reach as many platforms as possible. You think that, yeah, the platform, multi-platform, and not using the unique features might play into this?
Yeah, I had an entire slide about that I took out because I didn't want the entire thing to be just a rant on the state of things. But the problem with that is that now with like rising budgets and everyone trying to make the most of everything, if you're trying to reach every platform possible or as many as possible, you essentially have to dumb your game down to the smallest denominator that fits all the different places. So only like really dedicated first-party titles that are only for a certain console can take advantage of all the features. Otherwise, you would have to redesign the game too much to make proper use of them. Yeah, but I totally see what you mean, and it's nice if a game like that comes around, like Tearaway on the PS Vita, that actually uses all the features, but everywhere else it's mostly just they're trying to see, can I somehow add a gimmick by making something work on the back touchscreen, and no one actually integrates it into the proper design process. Yeah, that's a big advantage of your own self-made game consoles. If you start from scratch, it's a 100% exactly what you want. But as I said, very small target audience. Any more questions? Otherwise, if you want to catch me outside for a game of rock, paper, scissors or something, let me know. Thank you very much.